Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer, and welcome to Write Better Stories. My co-host today is one Pringle Backer. We are going to talk about an awesome novel that I really like called White Teeth by Zadie Smith. Today, for White Teeth, I'm going to talk about the concept of fate, which is, I would say, the sort of thematic core of the book, and then also a little bit about genetics and a concept that I'm sure probably has a more academic name, but I will call white indecision, and I'll tell you more about what that means in a minute. So one of the interesting things about this book is that it concerns the experiences of immigrants, but the main character, or one of the main characters, is actually a white British man who is not an immigrant named Archie Jones. And I think that this is actually a similar move to what we saw in Nightwood, where that's a book about a love triangle between three women, but then she starts the book with a straight white male character. And so I think that this is, as I said in that video, what's going on in White Teeth, very similar, because it's a investigation of marginalized identities, and they actually narratively put them on the margin, just as they're marginalized in real life. But Archie Jones actually intends to kill himself, but by a twist of fate, he ends up being saved by a butcher who wants him to move his car. And this, he feels, gives him a new lease on life. And so he starts taking more chances, and by total chance and fate, he stumbles into, I believe it's like a end of the world party, but kind of like ironically. And he meets, by total fate and happenstance, Clara Bowden, who is a Jamaican immigrant, and he marries her. And more on that theme of fate, Clara Bowden is described as having braided hair into the shape of a horseshoe that changes direction depending on whether she's feeling lucky or unlucky. And so that concept of luck, I think, definitely connects to that idea of fate, because it's as though there is some sort of order that will work in your favor for good luck, or a predestination of something that will not work in your favor if it's bad luck. And I was a little disappointed that she didn't really continue this throughout the book, because I thought that was kind of a quirky, fun detail for Clara's character, but I didn't really see it get mentioned a lot after that. But not that bad of a critique overall. So Archie's best friend is an immigrant from Bangladesh named Samad Iqbal, and they met in World War II. Samad Iqbal has a much different relationship with fate than Archie does. So Archie makes a lot of his decisions by flipping a coin, and this, again, I think is very clearly connected to this idea of fate, that he's just letting where the random happenstance of a coin flip make his decisions in life. Now, I think this also has to do with the sort of luxury that he has to do this as a privileged identity. He doesn't really have a lot riding on whether it's heads or tails, and so he can just flip a coin. Whereas Samad Iqbal frequently invokes his great-grandfather Mangal Pandey, an Indian soldier who apparently fired the first shot in an important mutiny, but he missed. Samad Iqbal sees this as a legacy that he needs to keep up, that his great-grandfather was this brave man, and it's his destiny and his fate in order to carry on this tradition. But when they're in Eastern Europe after capturing a Nazi doctor, Samad Iqbal ends up getting really high on opium, and he questions whether he is capable of fulfilling the destiny set forth by his great-grandfather. Samad Iqbal also struggles with the expectations that he feels comes from his religion and from being an immigrant who's come to London. So he's a Muslim from Bangladesh, and he wants to live a chaste life. He wants to avoid alcohol and not eat pork, but he ends up having an affair, he cheats on his wife, he drinks Guinness, and he eats hot dogs. I think this is also connected to that idea of fate, is that as a good Muslim, he was fated to follow the strictures of the religion, but then he can't always do that. And again, this is a contrast to the way that Archie has sort of a flippant attitude toward the decisions that he makes in his life. He's not really bound by that same set of expectations. So Samad Iqbal has twin boys named Milyat and Majid, and he also expects himself as a Muslim man to make sure that his sons grow up to be good Muslims. Now, there are added pressures of doing this because there are second generation immigrants coming into London, and so Samad is an adult and he's already kind of turned out and he's committed to the cause, even though he doesn't always follow it. But Milyat and Majid are more blank slates. And so they are basically vulnerable to the Western decadence. And I believe it's a money issue, but Samad Iqbal is only able to send one of his sons back to Bangladesh, and he chooses Majid, who's the more precocious one, the more bookish one, whereas Milyat is the more popular one. He's described as a beautiful boy. But what's interesting is that the one who gets sent back to Bangladesh ends up becoming an atheist, and he becomes very interested in English literature and English law, and ends up moving back to London in order to be the apprentice of a geneticist named Marcus Chelfin. Whereas Milyat, after getting involved in American culture and American movies and Robert De Niro and drugs and chasing girls, he actually gets involved with a group called the Keepers of the Eternal and Victorious Islamic Nation, or Kevin. So this is another way of playing with this idea of fate, that even if perhaps they are not fated by their religion to turn out in a certain way, you could argue that just by their circumstances, they were fated to turn out in expected ways, but they subvert our expectations. So Marcus Chelfin, the geneticist that Majid ends up studying with later, is also the father of the Chelfin family. The Chelfins, they have like their heads up their own asses. They use their last name as a verb and an adjective, and they just have this great sense of pride and success. And Joyce Chelfin also comments that there's so many successful people in her family that it must be in their genes. Now, this could obviously be read as just a kind of throwaway line like, oh, I guess there's something in the water. But given the rest of the book's preoccupation with genetics and determinism, this, I think, is a sort of cryptic way of just talking about white supremacy, is that given all of their success and their smarts, Joyce just concludes that it's like, well, yeah, we're the best, and it's our like white man's burden to educate the immigrants who come into the country. So Joyce says this to Clara Bowden as they're looking at all of these family photographs on the Chelfin mantle, and she asks Clara, like, how did Clara get so smart? And then Clara responds by saying, oh, it must have been one of her white ancestors. But then she like really regrets saying this. That's one of the more like tragic parts of the book, in my opinion. So the project that Majid works on with Marcus Chelfin is this thing called Future Mouse, where they're going to genetically engineer a mouse and then put it on exhibit. And I'm not really a science guy, so I won't get too much into the details of that, but thematically the importance is that it's heavily connected to this idea of fate. So thematically, this future mouse and the genetic manipulation that they do to it has a lot to do with trying to eliminate the randomness and chaos that can happen. Now, specifically, they're talking about like cancer and tumors, and in their scientific worldview, they think that they're only doing something good, but then obviously, historically, this idea is very similar to eugenics, as though you can sort of control for these sort of contingencies and randomness of disfavorable people coming into your country and eroding the culture and values there. So this is where we start to see this concept of fate not necessarily just being something that is a fun thing to play with in the book, but to actually have this real world and societal importance. So the Nazi in this book, that Dr. Sick or Dr. Perret, I don't know how to say his name, he ends up being closely associated with this idea of genetics, which might seem kind of obvious, but not just the idea of genetics, but specifically the idea of genetics with the intention of eliminating randomness. And this could be viewed as like a veiled way of saying like eliminate bad genes or disfavorable identities in the world. And so like in the scene where we flash back to the root canals of Archie Jones and Samad Iqbal in Eastern Europe, they end up capturing Dr. Sick, and Samad Iqbal feels like it's their chance to fulfill their destiny and, in his case, live the fate set forth by his great-grandfather by killing this Nazi. So then he ends up getting high on opium and becomes a little bit disillusioned with this plan. So he makes Archie take him behind some trees to go kill him. And earlier, when the Nazis captured two, he asks if he's going to be killed, and they tell him, like, well, we're going to pass you over to the authorities. And he's like, well, it would be nice to know. And this might be kind of like an absurd moment for him, but at the same time, I think that this establishes his character as somebody that doesn't like to leave things up to chance. He wants to know. He wants to eliminate that sense of uncertainty and control for all factors. Now, I don't think this is supposed to be some broad statement about Nazism as much as it is thematically tying these threads together in the book. This idea of having control over the future with this theme of fate that she has set forth so far. So then, the way that the scene plays out is that the gunshot rings out and Archie stumbles back all bloody, and we kind of understand that he didn't actually kill the Nazi, although it's not explicitly said. And then later we get the flashback of the actual scene that took place with him and the Nazi. And so Archie's all prepared to kill him, but then the Nazi starts getting tricky and he starts philosophizing, and he quotes the existential philosopher Sartre. He expounds on this idea of wanting to control for randomness and wanting to know what's going to happen. Archie sort of agrees that it's like, well, it's just kind of the decisions that you have. If you have these conflicting obligations, then you're not necessarily fated to do one or the other. And then the Nazi agrees, but then he's like, yeah, but is it really so bad to want to control? And he associates that idea of like who should be allowed to control with being like the master race. And that is when Archie is like, you know what? I'll flip a coin. That's how I'll decide this. And I've already explained how that has to do with fate, but this also introduces this idea of white indecision, is that I think she's trying to tell us that Archie has the privilege, but also the problem as a white man in Britain of like not really knowing how to feel about this Nazi, is that he finds himself being swayed by his philosophizing, and it's not a hard yes for him that he should kill this Nazi. He should just leave it up to chance and decide it flippantly. But then it's funny because he flips the coin, it ends up flying out, and as he chases it, the Nazi grabs the gun and then shoots Archie in the leg. So, like, of course it was all bullshit just for the Nazi to save himself, but Archie finds himself tricked. So as all of the narrative threads are connected at the end at this big exhibit of the future mouse, Archie decides that he actually wants to go just sit on a hillside and not worry about it. So I think this kind of further demonstrates how detached he is as this privileged identity, is that he doesn't really feel the need to take a strong stance on it. He just wants to sort of stay out of it. But then at the end, Milliot ends up showing up with his brothers and Kevin, and he doesn't tell them, but he brings a gun, and he plans to shoot somebody, and the person he chooses is the Nazi doctor from the flashback, which is a little convenient, but again, it's a book about fate, so we can give it to her, is that it was as though he was fated to be there. And he decides to shoot, but then Archie stands up and jumps in the way, saving the Nazi doctor. Now, this is significant because this is one of the most decisive character actions that Archie has in the entire book, is that he doesn't have to flip a coin about this. He, just on pure gut instinct, decides to save the Nazi. And I think that this sort of turns into a statement about how white indifference or white indecision about consequential issues for minorities can lead into protecting the wrong people. And it's also interesting because his character action ends the book. It's very significant. And so it's not just like another one of the characters that's being followed. It's the guy that we began the story with. The guy that I said is like supposed to be forefronted in order to draw our attention to the way that the rest of the identities are on the margin. So it's like he actually does have a lot of consequences to his decisions, but they end up being misguided and directed into something sort of silly. But what's also cool is that Erie, his daughter, ends up having sex with both Majid and Milyat on the same day, and they're genetically identical twins. And I don't know if this is actually true, but at least according to the book, is that you can't determine the paternity of the baby because they're genetically identical. And so this basically could, if we were genetic determinists, make us wonder, well, it's like, well, is he going to turn into a radical like Milyat, or is he going to turn into a westernized immigrant like Majid? And the way that genetic determinism has been deconstructed in the book, it should be like, well, it really doesn't matter who the dad is that we're individuals, and this baby is just going to turn out based on the consequences of their decisions. And it won't have any bearing who the father is on the way that this child turns out. And we can extrapolate on that is that basically this whole idea of like genetic determinism and the supposed fate that we could extrapolate from it is just bogus, and it might be better if we leave that behind with the Nazis. So then where this leaves us also is an interesting formal theme that runs through the book of this idea of ends. And I believe the Nazi also talks about how something without a beginning or an end is chaos. And so we end up seeing Zadie Smith play with this idea of having to end the book by giving it this big climactic end where all the threads come together. And this reminds me a lot of the video that I did on I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Charlie Kaufman, which deconstructs the sort of contrivances that stories come up with in order to deliver their information and how real life isn't really like that. And so the end of that movie, spoiler, is this very silly climactic end of the main character on stage delivering this big song that thematically concludes his character's journey. And the makeup is like very obviously fake, and the set is very fake on stage, and it's calling attention to the way that it's kind of a false ending, or that endings or neat, tidy conclusions to stories tend to be false and just contrivances of stories. So likewise, in White Teeth by Zadie Smith, the book opens with the inscription that what's past is prologue. And I think what that means for the book is that the idea of having a neat end to something is to sort of continue this false notion of fate, is that things are going to end up in a certain way, either favorably or unfavorably, but that is a projection. That's not really real. And so even though she gives us this very heightened theatrical end, she sort of has to do that because it's a book. And in real life, things don't really have that end. Things just keep on going. The next generation is going to go on. Erie has her daughter. The stories are just going to keep on being told. And so I know I didn't talk about that quite as much in this video, but it ends up firmly placing this book within the postmodern genre because it does sort of deconstruct the contrivances of storytelling along with analyzing the way that these different identities have to deal with their respective concepts of fate in the book. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope this helps you write better stories. And so does Pringle. He's afraid of the camera. I'm going to let him do his thing. He's on my knee right now.